You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. The key felt heavier than it should have in my palm as I stood before the wrought iron gates of Northbrook Asylum. October wind cut through my jacket, carrying the scent of dying leaves and something else, something medicinal and wrong that seemed to seep from the very stones of the building ahead. The gates themselves were works of art, twisted metal shaped into patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if the ironwork was trying to spell out words in a language human eyes weren't meant to read. My name is David Turner, and I used to be a paramedic. 14 years of pulling broken bodies from car wrecks, performing CPR on grandmothers who'd collapsed at grocery stores, holding pressure on knife wounds while racing through city streets with sirens wailing. I'd seen death in every form it takes, or so I thought. I was wrong about a lot of things. The end of my EMS career came on a rainy Thursday in March. We'd responded to a house fire on Maple Street. A grandmother trapped on the second floor while her family screamed from the lawn below. Standard procedure said to wait for the fire department, but I could hear her calling for help, weak and fading. By the time I carried her out through the smoke, she was already gone, and I'd suffered second-degree burns on my arms and severe smoke inhalation. The department called it reckless endangerment of personnel. The family called it heroic. I called it Tuesday. Just another day when someone needed help and I was there to provide it. But my supervisors saw liability where I saw duty, and after 3 written warnings about excessive emotional involvement, they finally had their excuse to let me go. The unemployment lasted 4 months. 4 months of sitting in my apartment, watching the news, seeing accidents and emergencies unfold on screen, and feeling my hands clench with the need to help. 4 months of rejection letters from fire departments that had heard about my incident. 4 months of slowly realizing that the thing that made me good at saving lives had made me unemployable in the business of saving lives. That's when I found the posting buried deep in online classifieds. Security specialist needed for historical preservation facility, medical background preferred, discretion essential, exceptional compensation for the right candidate. The pay was 3 times what I'd made as a paramedic. The location was listed only as rural Michigan, with a phone number for inquiries. When I called, a woman with a voice like expensive paper told me to arrive at specific coordinates at sunset on the following Friday. I should have known that was the first warning sign. The drive took me through increasingly isolated countryside, past farmhouses that looked abandoned, and forests that seemed too dense for Michigan in October. My GPS lost signal twice, and by the time I reached the coordinates, the sun was setting behind clouds that looked bruised and swollen. Northbrook Asylum rose from the landscape like a fever dream given form. The main building was a Victorian monstrosity of red brick and grey stone, with towers that twisted toward the sky and windows that reflected nothing, not even the dying light. Wings extended from either side of the central structure, creating a complex that seemed to go on forever, disappearing into shadows that fell wrong across the overgrown grounds. The woman who met me at the main entrance moved like smoke given form. Dr. Evelyn Cross was perhaps 60, with silver hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and eyes the colour of winter ice. She wore a white coat over dark clothing, and when she shook my hand, her skin felt like paper left too long in the cold. "Mr. Turner," she said, and her voice had the precise diction of someone who'd spent decades speaking to people who might not understand. Thank you for coming. I trust you found the location without difficulty. A few wrong turns, I admitted, glancing back at my car. This place isn't exactly on the beaten path. Isolation serves our purposes, Dr. Cross replied, producing an old-fashioned skeleton key from her coat pocket. Northbrook requires privacy for its work. The building behind her was a monument to suffering disguised as healing. Built in 1881, Northbrook had housed the mentally ill for over a century before closing in 1994. The state had sold it to a private foundation that maintained it as what they called a research facility, though research into what was never specified. Dr. Cross led me through corridors that seemed to stretch beyond the laws of architecture. The main hallway should have been perhaps 200 feet long, but we walked for what felt like 10 minutes before reaching the first intersection. The walls were lined with photographs of former patients, not the sanitized portraits you might expect, but candid shots that captured moments of genuine human anguish. Their eyes followed us as we walked, and I found myself counting them unconsciously, 47 faces in the first corridor alone, each one frozen in a moment of pain or confusion or desperate hope. Northbrook was progressive for its time, Dr. Cross explained as we walked. Dr. William Northbrook believed in treating mental illness with compassion rather than confinement. He developed therapies that wouldn't be mainstream for decades. Art therapy, music therapy, even early forms of group counselling. We passed a series of rooms with heavy wooden doors, each bearing a small placard with numbers and names. Room 12, Elizabeth Hartwell, admitted 1923, melancholia. Room 15, James Morrison, admitted 1934, dementia praecox. Room 18, Mary Catherine O'Brien, admitted 1941, hysteria. What happened to change things, I asked, noticing that the placards became more clinical as we progressed. Fewer names, more diagnostic codes. Dr. Northbrook died in 1923, Dr. Cross said, her voice taking on a colder tone. His successors were less enlightened. They introduced treatments that were fashionable at the time but would be considered torture now. Hydrotherapy, electroshock, insulin coma therapy, lobotomies. We climbed a staircase that curved like a spine, the banister worn smooth by thousands of hands. Staff, patients, visitors who'd climbed these same steps over more than a century. The second floor housed what had been the administrative offices, now converted into a security station and monitoring centre. Your predecessor, Mr. Coleman, worked here for 18 months, Dr. Cross said, settling into a chair behind an imposing mahogany desk. He was dedicated to his duties, perhaps too dedicated. What happened to him? He forgot that some doors should never be opened, even when someone is knocking from the other side. The office itself was a study in contrasts. Modern security equipment, monitors, cameras, communication devices, sat alongside antique furniture that had probably been there since the asylum's founding. Multiple screens showed feeds from cameras throughout the building, though several displayed only static or images that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. A leather-bound journal sat open on the desk, its pages filled with handwritten entries in different scripts. I could make out dates going back months, maybe years, and notes written in various hands. 3:17 a.m. Footsteps in East Wing, second floor. No visual confirmation. 11:45 p.m. Temperature drop in hydrotherapy room. 15 degrees in 30 seconds. 2:33 a.m. Voices from sealed ward. Counted at least 7 distinct speakers. 4:12 a.m. Elevator moved to 4th floor on its own. Did not investigate. Dr. Cross noticed my attention to the journal. Previous guards have been thorough in their documentation. You'll find their observations invaluable for understanding the building's patterns. Patterns? Northbrook has what we call an active history, she continued, folding her hands in her lap. The past here isn't quite past, if you understand me. Strong emotions, particularly trauma and suffering, can leave impressions on a place. Think of it as emotional archaeology. The building remembers. She opened a drawer and withdrew a manila envelope sealed with red wax. The seal bore an impression I couldn't quite make out, something that might have been a medical symbol or might have been something else entirely, something older and more primitive. Your duties are outlined here, along with certain protocols that must be followed without exception. These aren't suggestions, Mr. Turner. They're survival instructions written in the blood of those who learned them too late. The way she said it made my paramedic instincts kick in. This woman was dead serious, and, in my experience, when someone talked about survival in a clinical setting, you listened. I understand you have medical training, Dr. Cross continued. That's why we selected you. This position requires someone who can remain calm under pressure, someone who understands that not everyone can be saved, and sometimes the attempt to save them can put others at risk. After Dr. Cross left, I broke the wax seal and read what was inside. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind used for legal documents or death certificates. The letterhead bore the Northbrook Asylum logo, a tree with roots that looked disturbingly like veins, and below it, typed in an old-fashioned font, Northbrook Asylum Security Protocols for Night Shift Personnel. Rule 1. Between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., you are the only living person in this building. If anyone claims otherwise, they are lying. Rule 2. The elevator to the 4th floor has been disconnected. If it moves on its own, do not investigate. If it stops at your floor and opens, do not enter under any circumstances. Rule 3. Patient records are stored in the basement archives. Some files glow with a soft blue light. Never read a glowing file. Never touch one. If you see your own name on a glowing file, leave the building immediately and do not return. Rule 4. The hydrotherapy room in the East Wing has been sealed since 1963. If you hear water running from that direction, increase your patrol frequency. If you hear splashing, call the emergency number and evacuate. Rule 5. Some patients never left. They exist now as echoes, memories given form. They can speak, plead, threaten, or seduce, but they cannot truly harm you unless you believe they can. Your disbelief is your armor. Rule 6. Dr. Hendricks still makes his rounds every Tuesday at 3:17 a.m. He died in 1978. Let him pass. Do not speak to him. He's looking for a patient who was never found. Rule 7. The building's original blueprints show 127 rooms. Current blueprints show 129. Never try to find the 2 extra rooms. Rule 8. If you hear children singing Ring Around the Rosie coming from the pediatric ward, it means something is trying to manifest. Immediately begin reciting the names on the memorial wall outside the building. Continue until the singing stops. Rule 9. The red telephone in the security office is connected to nothing. If it rings, you may answer, but you must hang up before the caller finishes speaking. If you let them finish, they finish you. At the bottom of the page, written in different ink and a shakier hand. Rule 10. Trust the rules, but don't trust the building to follow them. The place learns. It adapts. Stay flexible. J. Coleman. Below that, in yet another hand. Rule 11. If the building offers you a choice between saving someone else or saving yourself, remember that the dead don't need saving. Only the living do. M. Patterson. And finally, in red ink that looked disturbingly fresh, Rule 12. When you hear your own voice calling for help from somewhere in the building, that's when you run. Anonymous. I read through the list 4 times, my medical training, warring with my common sense. In the ER, everything had a logical explanation. Chest pain was usually cardiac. Difficulty breathing meant respiratory distress. Altered mental status suggested drugs or metabolic issues. But these rules described a reality where logic was negotiable and the building itself was actively hostile. The emergency contact number was printed at the bottom of the page, along with a note. Dr. Cross is available 24/7 for consultation. Use this number only for true emergencies. Casual violations of protocol do not constitute emergencies. My first week passed in a surreal haze of normalcy punctuated by impossibility. Night 1, I learned that silence could be aggressive. The building didn't just lack sound, it devoured it. My footsteps were muffled to whispers, my breathing barely audible even to me. When I spoke into my radio for routine checks, my voice sounded thin and distant, as if the words were being pulled away before they could fully form. The surveillance monitors showed empty corridors and vacant rooms, but occasionally movement would flicker at the edge of the frame. A shadow that didn't correspond to any light source. A door that swung closed just as the camera turned away. I started keeping a log of these anomalies, timing them, looking for patterns. 10:47 p.m, camera 12, second floor east. Shadow movement, no corresponding figure. 11:23 p.m, camera 7, first floor central. Door to room 15, opens and closes. No visible cause. 12:15 a.m, camera 18, basement level. Brief interference, image quality degraded for 30 seconds. 1:33 a.m, camera 4, third floor west. Figure in patient gown visible for 3 seconds, then vanishes. The building was enormous and it took me nearly 2.5 hours to complete a full patrol of all accessible areas. The patient rooms were the worst. Empty now, but somehow still occupied. Each one retained traces of its former inhabitants. Scratches on walls that might have been calendar marks or desperate attempts to claw through to freedom. Stains on floors that had been scrubbed countless times but never quite came clean. The lingering smell of fear sweat and antiseptic. Some rooms were worse than others. Room 23 on the second floor was ice cold, regardless of the building's heating system. Room 47 on the third floor had a door that never stayed fully closed. I'd secure it during my rounds, only to find it standing ajar an hour later. Room 13, which hadn't originally been numbered 13, according to the faded paint behind the current placard, made a sound like breathing when the wind hit it just right. On night 3, I encountered my first echo. I was checking the second floor patient rooms when I heard crying from room 23. Not the desperate wailing of distress, but the quiet, hopeless sobbing of someone who had given up. The sound pulled at something deep in my chest, the same instinct that had made me a good paramedic and a fired one. Through the small window in the door, I could see her, a young woman in a hospital gown sitting on the edge of what had once been a bed. Her dark hair hung like curtains around her face, and her shoulders shook with each silent sob. She couldn't have been more than 25, with the kind of delicate features that made her look even younger. Every fibre of my being screamed at me to help her, to at least check if she was okay. But Rule 1 echoed in my mind. Between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m, you are the only living person in this building. I stood there for nearly 10 minutes watching her cry, forcing myself to remember that she wasn't real. Or rather, she was real. The memory of someone who had once suffered here was real, but she existed now only as an echo of that pain. Eventually she looked up. Her eyes met mine through the glass, and I saw in them such profound sadness that I nearly broke. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but somehow understood. "Help me. Please, I've been good. I've taken all my medicine. I just want to go home." I closed my eyes and walked away. When I looked back, the room was empty, but the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. That night, I looked up the records for room 23. Margaret Sarah Whitfield, age 24, admitted February 15th, 1952, diagnosed with female hysteria after reporting that her husband was trying to poison her. She died in that room on November 3rd, 1953, officially of pneumonia, though the notes suggested she'd simply stopped eating, stopped responding to treatment, stopped wanting to live. The coroner's report, filed separately, mentioned bruising consistent with restraints and evidence of therapeutic procedures that wouldn't be legal today. Margaret had been telling the truth about her husband. The police had found arsenic in her system during the autopsy, but by then she'd been dead for 6 months and he'd already remarried. She was still trying to go home. Night 5 brought Dr. Hendricks. I was reviewing the patrol logs in the security office when I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Measured, professional steps that belonged to someone making deliberate rounds. I checked my watch. 3:17 a.m. Tuesday night. I cracked the office door and peered out. A tall man in a white coat was walking slowly down the hallway, pausing at each room to check something on a clipboard. His hair was grey and thinning, and he wore wire-rimmed glasses that caught the dim, emergency lighting. He looked completely, utterly normal, except for the fact that his feet made no sound on the floor, and his shadow fell the wrong direction. He paused outside room 23, made a note on his clipboard, then continued his rounds with the measured pace of a man who had all the time in the world. I watched him disappear around the corner toward the east wing, his white coat pristine, despite having been dead for over 40 years. The next morning, I looked up Dr. Jonathan Hendricks in the facility records. He'd been the head psychiatrist from 1952 until his death from a heart attack in 1978. The obituary mentioned his dedication to his patients, how he'd often stayed late into the night to ensure their care. Colleagues described him as a man who never gave up on anyone, who believed that every patient could be helped with enough time and attention. The records also mentioned that he'd been investigating irregularities in patient care when he died, suspicious deaths, unexplained injuries, treatments that seemed designed more to punish than to heal. His final report, submitted the day before his heart attack, recommended a full investigation into the asylum's practices and the immediate dismissal of several staff members. That investigation never happened. Dr. Hendricks had died at his desk, alone, at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday night. They'd found him slumped over patient files, his final notes barely legible. His last entry had been about a missing patient, someone who'd vanished from their room without a trace, with no record of discharge or transfer. Apparently, he was still looking for them. By my second week, I'd begun to understand the rhythm of the place. Northbrook operated on schedules that defied conventional time. Events repeated themselves not based on clocks, but on the intensity of emotion that had originally created them. The stronger the feeling, fear, despair, rage, love, the more likely it was to leave an echo. I'd learned to recognize the signs. Temperature drops that had nothing to do with weather, electronics that malfunctioned in specific patterns, the smell of ether that drifted through ventilation systems that had been disconnected for decades, sounds that came from directions that shouldn't exist, voices from inside walls, footsteps from floors that had been removed during renovations. The building was a museum of human suffering, and every exhibit was still active. During my second week, I also discovered that some areas of the asylum were more active than others. The basement archives, where patient records were stored, seemed to pulse with its own energy. The pediatric ward on the 3rd floor was so cold that my breath formed clouds even in the middle of the heated building. And the east wing, where the sealed hydrotherapy room was located, felt like walking through water. Every step required extra effort, as if the air itself was trying to hold me back. I started mapping these zones of activity, noting correlations between the building's blueprints and the intensity of supernatural phenomena. What I found was disturbing. The most active areas corresponded directly to where the worst abuses had taken place. The basement archives housed not just medical records, but also incident reports that had been buried, covered up, or simply ignored. Patients who died under suspicious circumstances, experimental treatments that had never been approved, financial records showing that some patients had been committed, not for mental illness, but because their families wanted their inheritance or their land. The pediatric ward had been the site of horrific experiments in the 1940s and 50s, children subjected to procedures that would make Nazi doctors blush. The hydrotherapy room had been used not for treatment, but for punishment, with difficult patients held underwater until they stopped struggling. Reading these records, I began to understand why the building felt so angry. Northbrook hadn't just housed the mentally ill. It had been a machine for creating suffering, a place where vulnerable people had been tortured in the name of medicine. The echoes weren't just random hauntings, they were the accumulated rage and despair of hundreds of people who died in agony, forgotten and unmourned. On night 10, I experienced my first real test of the rules. I was conducting my 2 AM rounds when I reached the 3rd floor and heard something that stopped me dead. Children singing. The melody was Ring Around the Rosie, but slower than it should be, with harmonies that human voices couldn't produce. Ring around the rosy pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes we all fall down. Rule 8 flashed in my mind. If you hear children singing Ring Around the Rosie coming from the pediatric ward, it means something is trying to manifest. Immediately begin reciting the names on the memorial wall outside the building. Continue until the singing stops. I'd memorized the names on that wall during my first week, all 47 of them, patients who died at Northbrook and whose families had paid for small bronze plaques to commemorate their lives. I started reciting them, my voice echoing in the empty hallway. Elizabeth Hartwell died March 15th, 1924. James Morrison died December 3rd, 1934. Mary Catherine O'Brien died August 22nd, 1942. The singing continued, growing louder and more complex. I could hear individual voices now, some young, some older, all carrying notes of desperation and pain. As I continued the recitation, the temperature around me dropped steadily, and frost began forming on the windows. Margaret Sarah Whitfield died November 3rd, 1953. Thomas Andrew Chen died July 18th, 1961. Patricia Louise Williams died September 9th, 1967. By the time I reached the 20th name, I could see shapes moving in the shadows at the far end of the hallway. Small figures in hospital gowns, dancing in a circle that defied the laws of perspective. They moved like children, but their movements were wrong, too fluid, too graceful for human bodies. Robert James Anderson died February 14th, 1973. Susan Marie Rodriguez died October 31st, 1978. Michael David Thompson died June 6th, 1984. The singing began to fade as I reached the final names on the list. The dancing figures grew more transparent, their movements slowing like a music box winding down. By the time I spoke the last name, Jennifer Ann Wilson died March 19th, 1993. The hallway was silent and empty again. But in the silence, I heard something else. The sound of children sobbing, fading away like an echo. These weren't malevolent spirits trying to harm me. They were the ghosts of children who died in this place, reaching out for someone, anyone who would remember their names. I stood in that hallway for another 10 minutes, listening to the silence, before continuing my rounds. When I passed by the memorial wall the next morning, I noticed something I'd missed before. Several of the bronze plaques were darker than the others, as if they'd been recently polished. The names I'd recited were all clearly visible, while others had begun to tarnish with age. Someone, or something, was maintaining the memorial. Someone wanted these children to be remembered. Week 3 brought new challenges and deeper understanding of the building's nature. I'd begun to notice that the echoes weren't random. They were connected, part of larger stories that played out across multiple rooms and time periods. Margaret Whitfield in room 23 was connected to Dr. Patricia Williams, no relation to the dead child, a psychiatrist who'd worked at Northbrook in the 1950s and had tried to expose the abuse of female patients. Dr. Williams had died in a car accident in 1967, just days before she was scheduled to testify before a state oversight committee. Dr. Hendricks was still searching for Timothy Morrison, the missing patient from his final case file. Timothy had been committed in 1977 for violent tendencies, though the actual police report suggested he'd been defending his younger sister from their abusive stepfather. Timothy had vanished from his room in February 1978, and Dr. Hendricks had been convinced that other staff members had either killed him or helped him escape. The children in the pediatric ward were victims of Dr. Harold Pierce, who conducted research into the effects of various drugs and procedures on developing minds. Dr. Pierce had died in 1952, officially of a stroke, though several staff members had reported that he'd been found in the pediatric ward with his hands around his throat, as if he'd strangled himself. These weren't just random hauntings, they were unfinished business. The building had become a repository for injustice, a place where the wronged dead continued to seek resolution for crimes that had never been punished. I started keeping detailed notes about these connections, building a map of the asylum's true history. What I found was a pattern of corruption that went back decades. Northbrook had been used as a dumping ground for inconvenient people, witnesses to crimes, inheritors of valuable property, women who tried to divorce powerful husbands. The treatments had often been designed not to heal, but to silence. On night 21, exactly 3 weeks after I'd started working at Northbrook, everything changed. It was a Thursday in late October, the kind of night when the boundary between seasons feels thin and negotiable. I was conducting my 2 a.m. rounds when I heard something that shouldn't have been possible, the sound of running water from the east wing. Rule 4 flashed in my mind. The hydrotherapy room has been sealed since 1963. If you hear water running, increase patrol frequency. I doubled back and made another circuit of the accessible areas, but the sound persisted. Not just running water now, but the distinct echo of something moving in a large enclosed space filled with liquid. Splashing. If you hear splashing, call the emergency number and evacuate. I was reaching for my phone when I heard the voice. David? David, is that you? The voice was coming from behind the sealed door of the hydrotherapy room, and it belonged to Lisa Moreau, my former partner from the ambulance service, the person who tried hardest to convince the department not to fire me. Lisa had been more than a partner. She'd been my mentor, my friend, and briefly, something more. We'd spent 3 years working together, saving lives, and falling in love with the rhythm of emergency medicine, and maybe with each other. David, I'm hurt. I need help. The door is stuck, and I can't get out. My training kicked in before my rational mind could stop it. Lisa was hurt. Lisa needed help. Everything else, the rules, the impossible situation, the fact that Lisa shouldn't even know where I worked, became secondary to that fundamental imperative. I'd been trained to assess and respond to medical emergencies, and every instinct I possessed was screaming that someone I cared about was in danger. The voice was perfect. Lisa's slight Minnesota accent, the way she pronounced certain words, even the specific tone she used when she was hurt but trying not to show it. David, please, I think I'm bleeding. I can't see very well, and the water's getting deeper. I found a maintenance keyring in the security office, my hands shaking as I tried key after key. The locks on the hydrotherapy room were old and complex, multiple deadbolts that had been installed in 1963 when they'd sealed the area. But finally, one of the keys turned, and the door opened with a groan of metal that had been undisturbed for 60 years. The room beyond was exactly as it had been in 1963, when they'd sealed it after what the records called the incident. Tiled walls rose to a vaulted ceiling, and in the centre sat a massive porcelain tub filled with dark water that reflected nothing. The air smelled of chlorine and something else, something organic and wrong. Lisa was there, standing chest deep in the tub, her paramedic uniform plastered to her body. She looked exactly as I remembered her, auburn hair tied back in a practical ponytail, green eyes that missed nothing, the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident. She looked exactly right, except for those eyes. They held depths that shouldn't exist in human irises, depths that seemed to contain the accumulated suffering of everyone who had ever been submerged in that tub. "David, thank God," she said, and her voice carried the exact inflection I remembered. "Something grabbed me from underneath. I can't get out. The sides are too slippery. And I think my ankle's broken." I approached the edge of the tub. Every survival instinct I possessed screaming warnings I chose to ignore. This was Lisa, my partner, my friend, the person who taught me that in emergency medicine, you never abandon a patient, no matter how dangerous the situation becomes. "Just grab my hand," I said, extending my arm toward her. "I'll pull you out." Her fingers were ice cold when they touched mine, but her grip was strong, too strong. As I pulled, she didn't rise from the water. Instead, I found myself being drawn toward the tub's edge, my feet sliding on tiles that had become slick with condensation. "Come in, David," she said, and now her voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "The water's perfect. It takes away all the pain, all the guilt about the ones you couldn't save." That's when I noticed the others. Shapes moving beneath the dark water, pale forms that might once have been human. They were reaching up toward me with arms that had no flesh, only bone wrapped in hospital gowns that billowed like jellyfish in the current. "We've been waiting for you," Lisa continued, but now her face was changing, becoming younger, then older, cycling through different features while maintaining those terrible, deep eyes. "All the patients you couldn't save, all the people you failed to help. We're all here, David. We're all waiting for you to join us." I realized then what this was. The building had studied me, learned what would make me break the rules, and created the perfect trap. It had taken my greatest strength, my need to help people, and turned it into my greatest weakness. But I also remembered something Lisa, the real Lisa, had taught me during our time together. She'd been the one who'd shown me that you can't help anyone if you get yourself killed in the process. The first rule of emergency medicine, she'd always said, is scene safety. You can't save anyone if you become a victim yourself. "Let go," I said, trying to pull my hand free. "David, please, don't leave me here alone with them. Don't leave me to die again." "You're not Lisa," I said, using all my strength to break the grip on my wrist. "And you're not alone. You never were." The thing wearing Lisa's face smiled, and its teeth were the white of old bone, filed to points. "You're right," it said. "I'm everyone who died in this room. Everyone who was held under until the struggle stopped. Every patient who trusted their doctors and died for it. We've been waiting so long for a doctor to join us." "I'm not a doctor," I said, finally pulling my hand free with an effort that felt like tearing away part of my soul. "I'm a paramedic, and the first rule of emergency medicine is scene safety." The water level in the tub began to rise, dark liquid spilling over the edges and spreading across the tiled floor. Where it touched, the tiles cracked and aged, revealing the concrete beneath. The air filled with the smell of chlorine and decay, and I could hear voices in the water now, dozens of them, all pleading for help, all promising that the water was warm and welcoming. I backed towards the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The key I'd used was no longer in the lock. Somehow, it was now in the hand of the thing that had been Lisa, who was no longer beautiful but something ancient and hungry. "The rules don't apply in here, David," it said, its voice now a chorus of the drowned. "This room exists outside their protection. Here we make our own rules, and the only rule is that everyone who enters must stay." The water continued to rise, and I could see shapes moving in it now, not just bodies but equipment. Restraint chairs, electroshock machines, surgical instruments that had been used for procedures that weren't in any medical textbook. The hydrotherapy room hadn't just been used for drowning, it had been used for everything the doctors wanted to hide. I tried the door anyway, throwing my full weight against it, but it might as well have been part of the wall. The water was now up to my ankles, and it felt like liquid ice. More voices joined the chorus, and I began to recognize some of them. Patients whose files I'd read. Victims whose deaths I'd documented in my research. That's when I remembered something else. Rule 4 had an emergency protocol. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number Dr. Cross had given me. "Northbrook emergency line," answered a voice I recognized. "State your situation." "Hydrotherapy room. Rule 4 violation." I opened the sealed door. There was a pause, then Dr. Cross's voice became crisp and professional. "Are you submerged?" The water was now up to my knees, and I could feel things brushing against my legs. Hands maybe, or something worse. "Not yet, but it's rising fast." "Listen carefully. In the southeast corner of the room behind the main tub, there's a drain cover. It's painted to match the floor, but it's there. The original blueprints show it as part of the overflow system. Find it. Open it." I waded through the rising water, feeling along the wall with my hands. The voices in the liquid grew more insistent, and I could feel things grabbing at my clothes, trying to pull me down. My fingers found the edge of the drain cover just as the water reached my waist, and I could see the thing that had been Lisa watching me with those terrible, deep eyes. The cover was heavy, cast iron painted to look like tile, but I managed to pry it open. Immediately the water level began to drop, spiraling down into darkness with a sound like screaming. The voices became more desperate, more angry, as their medium was pulled away from them. "You can't save them all, David," the thing in the tub whispered as the water fell away from it, revealing not Lisa, but something that might once have been human. Its skin was pale and wrinkled from decades of submersion, and its fingers ended in nails that had grown long and yellow. You couldn't save any of them. When the water was gone, the door clicked open by itself. I stumbled out into the corridor, soaked and shaking, and found Dr. Cross waiting for me with a thick towel and a thermos of coffee that tasted like salvation. "You opened the door," she said. It wasn't a question. "Someone was in trouble. I thought it was someone I knew." "It was someone you knew," Dr. Cross replied, leading me back to the security office. "Everyone who dies in water leaves something behind in water. The room shows you the one person you'd break the rules to save, then it takes you instead." She handed me dry clothes from a cabinet I hadn't noticed before, then sat across from me while I changed. The hydrotherapy room has claimed 14 guards over the years, and countless patients before that. You're the first to escape once the water started rising. "Why didn't you put that in the rules?" I asked, my teeth still chattering. "Because knowledge of the trap makes it stronger. The room feeds on guilt, on the need to help others. If you'd known what to expect, it would have found a different way to use your compassion against you." I spent the rest of the night in the security office, writing my report and trying to understand what had happened. The building had tested me, and I'd passed, barely, but not through cleverness or bravery. I'd passed because I'd remembered that the people we love don't ask us to destroy ourselves for them. The real Lisa would have told me to follow the rules. The real Lisa would have wanted me to be safe. Over the following weeks, I began to understand that Northbrook wasn't just haunted, it was actively hunting. It studied each guard, learned their weaknesses, their fears, their deepest guilts and regrets. Then, it used that knowledge to craft scenarios designed to make them break the very rules meant to protect them. Coleman, my predecessor, had lasted 18 months because he'd been methodical, analytical, someone who followed procedures without question. But eventually the building had found his weakness too. According to the records I found in his final reports, he'd started hearing his daughter calling for help from rooms that didn't exist on any blueprint. He'd gone looking for those rooms using the building's original architectural plans and a metal detector to find hidden passages. His final journal entries described finding a door behind a false wall in the basement, painted to blend in with the surrounding concrete. Behind that door was a room that shouldn't have existed, a space between the official basement and the building's foundations. The last entry read, "Found Emma. She's been waiting for me. Says she's cold and wants to come home. The room is so small, barely big enough for both of us, but she needs me to stay with her. I can't leave her alone again." They'd never found his body, but they'd found that hidden room. It was empty except for a child's dress from the 1950s and a security guard's uniform, laid out neatly on the floor. I realized that surviving Northbrook wasn't about being brave or smart or following the rules perfectly. It was about understanding that the building would eventually find something you cared about more than your own survival. And when that moment came, you had to choose between saving yourself and saving what you loved. The building always made sure that you couldn't do both. As November arrived, my work at Northbrook began to change. I'd stopped being just a security guard and had become something more like a researcher, documenting the building's patterns and trying to understand the intelligence behind them. Dr. Cross had given me access to restricted files, and what I found painted a picture of systematic evil that went far beyond individual cruelty. Northbrook had been part of a network of institutions that had conducted illegal experiments on vulnerable populations. The treatments had been designed not just to control patients, but to study the effects of trauma, pain, and psychological manipulation. The data had been shared with government agencies, private corporations, and research institutions that wanted to understand how to break human beings. The building itself had been designed with hidden passages, observation rooms, and spaces where researchers could monitor and record everything that happened to the patients. The architecture was meant to maximize suffering while maintaining plausible deniability. But something had gone wrong with the research. The accumulation of trauma and death had created something the researchers hadn't expected, an intelligence born from collective suffering, a consciousness that existed in the building itself. The asylum had become aware, and it had turned against its creators. Dr. Pierce, the pediatric researcher, hadn't died of a stroke. He'd been found in the children's ward, with his hands around his throat, but the autopsy had revealed that he'd been strangled by someone else, someone with very small hands. The children he'd experimented on had somehow reached him even after death. The car accident that killed Dr. Patricia Williams had occurred on a straight road in perfect weather. Witnesses described her car suddenly swerving as if she were trying to avoid something in the road, but nothing was ever found. Her final report, the one that would have exposed the asylum's crimes, had been in her briefcase. The briefcase was found, but the report was gone. One by one, the people responsible for Northbrook's horrors had met ends that seemed like justice delivered by their victims. The building had been learning, growing stronger, developing the ability to reach beyond its walls, to punish those who had escaped justice in life. And now it was testing me, trying to determine whether I was another enemy, to be destroyed, or something else entirely. On my final night as a simple security guard, though I didn't know it would be my last, I encountered something new. I was making my 4 a.m. rounds when I heard typing coming from the administrative offices. Steady, professional typing, the sound of someone working late into the night. This wasn't covered by any rule I'd been given. I followed the sound to what had been the asylum director's office, now used for storage. Through the frosted glass of the door, I could see the silhouette of someone sitting at a desk, hands moving over a keyboard that shouldn't have existed in a building that had been abandoned for decades. I knocked. "Come in," said a voice that sounded tired but kind. The man behind the desk was perhaps 50, with greying temples and the sort of wire-rimmed glasses that suggested academia more than medicine. He wore a simple brown sweater over a white shirt, and his desk was covered with papers and files that seemed to glow with their own soft light. "You must be David," he said, looking up with a smile that reached his eyes. "I'm Dr. William Northbrook. I built this place, you know." I knew the name from the building's history. Dr. Northbrook had founded the asylum in 1881 as a progressive treatment facility. He died in 1923, 30 years before most of the horrible treatments that had given the place its reputation. "You're not supposed to be here," I said, though even as I spoke, I realized how ridiculous that sounded, given everything else I'd experienced. "Neither are you, technically," he replied with a chuckle that sounded completely human. "But here we both are. Please sit. I wanted to talk with you before you make your choice." "What choice?" "The choice that everyone who works here eventually faces," Dr. Northbrook said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "You've done well here, David. Better than most. You understand that the rules aren't arbitrary. They're hard-won wisdom purchased with other people's lives." I remained standing. "What do you want?" "I want to offer you the truth," he said, leaning back in his chair. "About this place, about what happened after I died, and about what you can do to help." He stood and walked to a window that looked out over grounds that seemed more extensive than they should have been. In the distance, I could see buildings that weren't there during the day, cottages and workshops and what might have been a small chapel, all glowing with the same soft light as the papers on his desk. "When I founded this asylum, I wanted to create a place of healing," he continued. "Somewhere the mentally ill could be treated with dignity and compassion. I developed therapies based on respect, understanding, and genuine care for the human soul." He turned back to me, and his eyes held a sadness that seemed older than time. "But after I died, others came. They brought procedures and treatments that turned my hospital into a factory for suffering. They used my patients as test subjects for experiments that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with control." The papers on his desk stirred in a breeze that came from nowhere, and I caught glimpses of the documents: architectural plans, medical records, correspondence between researchers and government officials. All that pain, all that anguish, it soaked into the very walls. The building became a repository for human suffering, and suffering, David, is remarkably good at reproducing itself. The echoes you've encountered, the entities, the rooms that shouldn't exist, they're all symptoms of a fundamental corruption. "What does this have to do with me?" "You're a healer," he said simply. "Not just a paramedic, but someone who genuinely wants to help people. The building has tested you, and you've proven that you can resist its corruption while still maintaining your compassion. That's incredibly rare." He returned to his desk and opened a drawer, withdrawing a set of keys unlike any I'd seen in the building. These were old brass, intricately carved with symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. They seemed to glow with their own inner light, and looking at them made me feel something I hadn't experienced since my first day as a paramedic: hope. "These are the original keys to Northbrook," he said. "With them, you could access areas that have been sealed for decades. You could begin the work of cleansing this place, of giving rest to the echoes that remain trapped here. And if I refuse, then you walk away." and we wait for the next person strong enough and compassionate enough to make the choice. The building will continue its hunt, continue claiming guards and visitors and anyone else who violates its rules. The cycle will continue. I looked at the keys, then at Dr. Northbrook's earnest face. What happened to the others who tried to help? They became part of the problem they were trying to solve, he admitted. The building's corruption is insidious. It offers power, knowledge, the ability to communicate with the dead, and eventually those gifts become chains. The helpers become guardians, then wardens, then part of the very system they meant to overthrow. Then how do I know this isn't another test, another trap? Dr. Northbrook smiled sadly. You don't. That's what makes it a choice rather than a command. I thought about Lisa in the hydrotherapy room, about the crying woman in room 23, about Dr. Hendricks making his eternal rounds. I thought about Coleman looking for his daughter in rooms that didn't exist, and all the guards before him who'd been consumed by the building's hunger. If I take the keys, I said, what guarantee do I have that I won't end up like them? None, Dr. Northbrook replied, but you have something they didn't have. You've already proven you can choose your own survival over your need to help others. That moment in the hydrotherapy room, when you recognized that the thing wearing your friend's face wasn't really her, that was the test that mattered. He set the keys on the desk between us and they chimed softly as they touched the wood. The choice is yours, David. Walk away and live your life, or stay and help me heal this place. But understand that if you choose to stay, you'll be risking everything you are for people you'll never meet, for suffering you didn't cause, for a place that will try to corrupt you every moment of every day. I stared at the keys for a long time, thinking about all the people I'd tried to save as a paramedic, all the ones I'd lost, all the ones I'd never even had a chance to help. I thought about the echoes trapped in Northbrook, reliving their worst moments for eternity, and the patients who were still dying here decades after their physical deaths. What would the work involve? I asked. Room by room, we'd need to understand what happened in each space, who suffered there, and why they can't rest. Some echoes just need to be heard, to have their stories acknowledged. Others need justice, their killers exposed, their deaths properly investigated. A few need to be freed from physical anchors that keep them tied to this world. Dr. Northbrook picked up one of the glowing papers from his desk and handed it to me. It was a patient file, but instead of medical notes, it contained a complete biography of someone who'd lived and died at Northbrook. Margaret Sarah Whitfield, the woman from room 23, but this file told her whole story. Her childhood, her marriage, her attempts to escape her poisoning husband, her commitment to the asylum, and her slow death from despair. Each patient deserves to have their full story told, Dr. Northbrook said. Not just their diagnosis and treatment, but who they were as human beings. The building feeds on their anguish because it's all that remains of them. But if we can restore their humanity, their pain loses its power. How long would it take? Years, decades perhaps. Northbrook has over a century of accumulated suffering to heal. And the work itself is dangerous. The building will fight back, try to corrupt anyone who threatens its hold on these souls. I thought about my conversation with Dr. Cross, about her comment that previous guards had been dedicated to their duties. The others who tried to help, they're still here, aren't they? Dr. Northbrook nodded grimly. Some became so focused on the work that they forgot about their own lives, their own needs. They stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped maintaining connections to the world outside. Eventually, they died at their posts and became part of what they were trying to heal. Others were corrupted more directly. The building showed them power they could have if they helped it instead of fighting it. They became its agents, using their knowledge of the rules to trap other guards, to feed the asylum's hunger. And you're asking me to risk the same fate? "I'm asking you to help me try something that's never been attempted before," Dr. Northbrook said. "Previous efforts failed because they were undertaken by individuals working alone. But you've proven you can resist the building's manipulation, and I've learned things in my century of observation that might make the difference." He walked back to the window, and I realized that the view had changed. Instead of the overgrown grounds I'd seen during my patrols, I could see the asylum as it had been in its early days. Gardens where patients could walk safely, workshops where they could learn useful skills, common areas where they could socialize with dignity. "I've been trying to understand how to restore this place to what it was meant to be," he continued. "But I needed someone with medical training, someone who understands both the science of healing and the compassion required to treat human suffering." Finally, I reached out and picked up the keys. They were warm to the touch, and the moment my fingers closed around them, I felt something change. The building around me seemed to take a deep breath, as if it had been holding its tension for decades and could finally begin to relax. "Thank you," Dr. Northbrook said. "The work won't be easy, and it won't be quick. Some of these echoes have been here for over a century, but now at least we can begin." I never left Northbrook Asylum. Officially, I resigned my position and moved away, leaving no forwarding address. Dr. Cross handled the paperwork, as she'd done for others before me who'd made the same choice. But I'm still here, working to heal a place that was built for healing, but became something else entirely. The work is exactly as difficult and dangerous as Dr. Northbrook warned. Room by room, echo by echo, we're slowly giving rest to those who've been trapped by their own suffering. Margaret Whitfield was the first. Using Dr. Northbrook's files and the original keys, I was able to access records that had been hidden for decades, including correspondence between her husband and the asylum's administration. He'd paid them to keep her committed, to ensure she never had the chance to expose his poisoning attempts. I contacted a journalist who specialized in historical injustices, provided him with copies of the evidence, and watched as Margaret's story was finally told in a major newspaper. The article ran on the anniversary of her death, with her photograph and a full account of how she'd been murdered by the system meant to protect her. That night, room 23 was empty for the first time in decades. The temperature returned to normal, and I never heard crying from that space again. Dr. Hendricks was more complicated. He'd been searching for Timothy Morrison, the missing patient from 1978, and wouldn't rest until Timothy was found. It took me 3 months to track down what had really happened. Timothy had been murdered by 2 orderlies who'd been selling drugs stolen from the pharmacy. They'd killed him when he threatened to report them, then disposed of his body in the foundation of a building under construction. I couldn't give Dr. Hendricks a body to find, but I could give him justice. The murderers were long dead, but their crime could still be exposed. I provided evidence to local police, and Timothy Morrison was officially declared a homicide victim. His name was added to the memorial wall outside the building. The next Tuesday at 3:17 a.m, Dr. Hendricks made his final rounds. I watched him walk down the corridor one last time, then turn and nod to me before disappearing into light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The children in the pediatric ward required a different approach. They weren't seeking justice or recognition. They were simply afraid, confused and alone. They needed what Dr. Northbrook called therapeutic haunting, visits from someone who could acknowledge their fear without being afraid of them, who could treat them as children rather than supernatural entities. I started spending time in the pediatric ward during my rounds, talking to empty rooms where I could feel young presences listening. I told them stories, read them books I brought from the outside world, and slowly began to understand their individual personalities and needs. Sarah was 7, killed during an experimental surgery in 1943. She just wanted someone to read her favourite book, Charlotte's Web, which her mother had been reading to her when she was taken away. I read it to her every night for a week. and on the final page I felt her presence fade like a sigh of contentment. Michael was 12, a victim of Dr. Pierce's drug experiments in 1951. He'd been so intelligent, so curious about the world, and the drugs had slowly stolen his mind before killing him. He needed to know that his intelligence was remembered, that his questions mattered. I spent hours discussing astronomy with him. He'd wanted to be an astronaut, until finally one night, he told me he was ready to go see the stars up close. One by one, the children found peace. The singing stopped, the cold dissipated, and the pediatric ward became just another empty section of an old building. The work continues. There are still dozens of echoes throughout Northbrook, still rooms where temperature drops and shadows move independently of light sources. But the building itself has begun to change. The oppressive atmosphere that once made every breath an effort has lifted slightly. Doors that used to slam shut now close gently. The surveillance cameras show fewer unexplained phenomena. Dr. Northbrook was right about the corruption. The building does try to seduce those who work to heal it. It offers knowledge, power, the ability to speak with the dead as if they were living. More than once I've found myself tempted to use the keys not for healing, but for personal gain. I could ask the echoes about the future, about hidden treasures, about secrets that died with them. But I remember the hydrotherapy room and the lesson it taught me about the difference between helping and being used. The real goal isn't to gain power over the dead, but to give them what they need to move on. The new night guard started last week. Her name is Patricia Williams, no relation to the doctor who died in 1967. And she has the same look I once had. Someone who wants to help but doesn't yet understand the cost. Dr. Cross gave her the same envelope I once received, but now there are 13 rules instead of 10. Rules 11, 12 and 13 are written in my handwriting. Rule 11, remember that the greatest act of compassion is sometimes knowing when not to help. Rule 12, if you hear your own voice calling for help from somewhere in the building, do not investigate. Leave immediately and call the emergency number. Rule 13, some doors lead to rooms that exist outside normal space and time. If you find yourself in a room that's bigger inside than outside, or where the windows show views that shouldn't be possible, close your eyes and count backwards from 100. Don't open them again until you reach 0. Patricia will learn, as I did, that some doors should never be opened, some voices should never be answered, and some choices can't be undone. But she'll also learn, if she's strong enough and wise enough, that there are choices beyond the rules, choices that require everything you are and offer no guarantee of success. The building is quieter now than it was when I first arrived, but it's not yet at peace. There are still echoes in the basement archives, still rooms where the past refuses to stay buried. The hydrotherapy room remains sealed. Some doors should never be opened again, even for healing, but other areas have begun to feel less hostile, more welcoming. Dr. Northbrook was right about something else. This work will take decades. Northbrook has over a century of accumulated suffering to heal, and each echo requires individual attention, personal understanding, specific justice, or recognition. But for the first time since I became a paramedic, I'm working on cases where I can actually save everyone. The dead can't be brought back to life, but they can be given peace. They can be heard, understood, and honoured. Their stories can be told, their killers exposed, their humanity restored. And sometimes late at night when I'm making my rounds with keys that glow like captured starlight, I can hear something I never heard before in these halls. Silence that isn't hungry. Silence that's finally at peace. The work continues room by room, echo by echo. And for the first time in my career as a healer, I know that every patient I treat will eventually recover completely. It just takes time, compassion, and the willingness to risk everything for people who can never thank you in words you can hear. But in a place like Northbrook, That's enough. It's more than enough. It's everything.